Chapter 11, Part 2 of Hunting in Many Lands. Our story is entitled Hunting in the Cattle Country by Theodore Roosevelt. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christian Lieberg. One of the antelope I killed while I was out on foot at nightfall, a couple of miles from the wagon. I left the shoulders and neck, carrying in the rest of the carcass on my back. On the other occasion I had my horse with me and took in the whole antelope, packing it behind the saddle, after it was dressed and the legs cut off below the knees. In packing an antelope or deer behind the saddle, I always cut slashes through the sinews of the legs just above the joints. Then I put the buck behind the saddle, run the picket rope from the horn of the saddle under the belly of the horse, through the slashes in the legs on the other side, bring the end back, swaying well down on it, and fasten it to the horn. Then I repeat the same feat for the other side. Packed in this way, the carcass always rides perfectly steady and cannot by any possibility shake loose. Of course, a horse has to have some little training before it will submit to being packed. The above experiences are just about those which befall the average ranchman when he is hunting antelope. To illustrate how much less apt he is to spend as many shots while after other game, I may mention the last mountain sheep and the last deer I killed, each of which cost me but a single cartridge. The bighorn was killed in the fall of 1894 while I was camped on the Little Missouri, some 10 miles below my ranch. The bottoms were broad and grassy, and were walled in by rows of high, steep bluffs, with back of them a mass of broken country, in many places almost impassable for horses. The wagon was drawn up on the edge of the fringe of tall cottonwoods which stretched along the brink of the shrunken river. The weather had grown cold, and at night the frost gathered thickly on our sleeping bags. Great flocks of sandhill cranes passed overhead from time to time, the air resounding with their strange, musical, guttural clangor. For several days we had hunted perseveringly, but without success, through the broken country. We had come across tracks of mountain sheep, but not the animals themselves, and the few blacktail which we had seen us first and escaped before we could get within shot. The only thing killed had been a white-tail fawn, which Lambert had knocked over by a very pretty shot as we were riding through a long, heavily timbered bottom. 4 men in stalwart health and taking much outdoor exercise have large appetites, and the flesh of the whitetail was almost gone. One evening Lambert and I hunted nearly to the head of one of the creeks which opened close to our camp, and in turning to descend what we thought was one of the side coulees leading into it, we contrived to get over the divide into the coulees of an entirely different creek system, and did not discover our error until it was too late to remedy it. We struck the river about nightfall, and were not quite sure where, and had 6 miles tramp in the dark along the sandy river bed and through the dense timber bottoms, wading the streams a dozen times before we finally struck camp, tired and hungry, and able to appreciate to the full the stew of hot venison and potatoes, and afterward the comfort of our buffalo and caribou hide sleeping bags. The next morning the sheriff's remark of, "Look alive, you fellows, if you want any breakfast," awoke the other members of the party shortly after dawn. It was bitterly cold as we scrambled out of our bedding, and after a hasty wash, huddled around the fire, where the venison was sizzling and the coffee pot boiling, while the bread was kept warm in the Dutch oven. About a third of a mile away to the west the bluffs, which rose abruptly from the river bottom, were crowned by a high plateau, where the grass was so good that overnight the horses had been led up and picketed on it, and the man who had led them up had stated the previous evening that he had seen what he took to be fresh footprints of a mountain sheep crossing the surface of a bluff fronting our camp. The footprints apparently showed that the animal had been there since the camp had been pitched. The face of the cliff on this side was very sheer, the path by which the horses scrambled to the top being around a shoulder and out of sight of camp. While sitting close up around the fire before finishing breakfast, and just as the first level sunbeam struck the top of the plateau, we saw on this cliff crest something moving, and at first supposed it to be one of the horses which had broken loose from its picket pin. Soon the thing, whatever it was, raised its head, and we were all on our feet in a moment, exclaiming that it was a deer or a sheep. It was feeding in plain sight of us only about a third of a mile distant, and the horses, as I afterward found out, were but a few rods beyond it on the plateau. The instant I realized that it was game of some kind, I seized my rifle, buckled on my cartridge belt, and slunk off toward the riverbed. As soon as I was under the protection of the line of cottonwoods, I trotted briskly toward the cliff, and when I got to where it impinged on the river I ran a little to the left, and selecting what I deemed to be a favorite place, began to make the ascent. The animal was on the grassy bench, some 8 or 10 feet below the crest, when I last saw it. But it was evidently moving hither and thither, sometimes on this bench and sometimes on the crest itself, cropping the short grass and browsing on the young shrubs. The cliff was divided by several shoulders or ridges, there being hollows like vertical gullies between them, and up one of these I scrambled, using the utmost caution not to dislodge earth or stones. Finally I reached the bench just below the skyline, and then, turning to the left, wriggled cautiously along it, hat in hand. The cliff was so steep and bulged so in the middle, and moreover, the shoulders of projecting ridges in the surface spoken above were so pronounced, that I knew it was out of the question for the animal to have seen me. But I was afraid it might have heard me. The air was absolutely still, and so I had no fear of its sharp nose. Twice in succession I peered with the utmost caution over the shoulders of the cliff, merely to see nothing beyond save another shoulder some 40 or 50 yards distant. Then I crept up to the edge and looked over the level plateau. Nothing was in sight excepting the horses, and these were close up to me, and, of course, they all raised their heads to look. I nervously turned half round, sure that if the animal, whatever it was in sight, it would promptly take the alarm. However, by good luck it appeared that at this time it was below the crest on the terrace or bench already mentioned, and, on creeping to the next shoulder, I at last saw it, a yearling mountain sheep, walking slowly away from me, and evidently utterly unsuspicious of any danger. I straightened up, bringing my rifle to my shoulder, and as it wheeled I fired, and the sheep made 2 or 3 blind jumps in my direction. So close was I to the camp, and so still was the cold morning, that I distinctly heard one of the 3 men who had remained clustered about the fire eagerly watching my movements call, "By George, he's missed! I saw the bullet strike the cliff." I had fired behind the shoulders, and the bullet, of course going through, had buried itself in the bluff beyond. The wound was almost instantaneously fatal, and the sheep, after striving in vain to keep its balance, fell heels over head down in a crevice, where it jammed. I descended, released the carcass, and pitched it on ahead of me, only to have it jam again near the foot of the cliff. Before I got it loose I was joined by my 3 companions, who had been running headlong toward me through the brush ever since the time they had seen the animal fall. I never obtained another sheep under circumstances which seemed to me quite so remarkable as these, for sheep are, on the whole, the wariest of game. Nevertheless, with all game there is an immense amount of chance in the chase, and it is perhaps not wholly uncharacteristic of a hunter's luck that, after having hunted faithfully in vain and with much hard labor for several days through a good sheep country, we should at last have obtained one within sight and earshot of camp. Incidentally, I may mention that I have never tasted better mutton, or meat of any kind, than that furnished by this tender yearling. In 1894, on the last day I spent at the ranch, and with the last bullet I fired from my rifle, I killed a fine whitetail buck. I left the ranch house early in the morning, on my favorite pony, Muley, my foreman riding with me. After going a couple of miles, by sheer good luck we stumbled on 3 whitetail, a buck, a doe, and a fawn, in a long winding coulee, with a belt of timber running down its bottom. When we saw the deer, they were trying to sneak off, and immediately my foreman galloped toward one end of the coulee and started to ride down through it, while I ran Muley to the other end to intercept the deer. They were, of course, quite likely to break off to one side, but this happened to be one of those occasions when everything went right. When I reached the spot from which I had covered the exits from the timber, I leapt off, and immediately afterward heard a shout from my foreman that told me the deer were on foot. Muley is a pet horse, and he enjoys immensely the gallop after game, but his nerves invariably fail him at the shot. He stood snorting beside me, and finally, as the deer came in sight, away he tore, only to go about 200 yards, however, and stand and watch us with his ears pricked forward until, when I needed him, I went for him. At the moment, however, I paid no heed to Muley, for a cracking in the brush told me the game was close, and in another moment I caught the shadowy outlines of the doe and the fawn as they scudded through the timber. By good luck the buck, evidently flurried, came right on the edge of the woods next to me, and as he passed, running like a quarter horse, I held well ahead of him and pulled the trigger. The bullet broke his neck, and down he went, a fine fellow with a handsome 10-point head, and fat as a prize sheep, for it was just before the rut. Then we rode home, and I sat in a rocking chair on the ranch house veranda, looking across the river at the strangely shaped buttes and the groves of shimmering cottonwoods until the sun went down and the frosty air bade me go in. I wish that members of the Boone and Crockett Club, and big game hunters generally, would make a point of putting down all their experiences with game, and with any other mark-worthy beasts or birds, in the regions where they hunt, which would be of interest to students of natural history, noting any changes of habits in the animals and any causes that tend to make them decrease in numbers, giving an idea of times at which the different larger beasts became extinct, and the like. Around my ranch on the Little Missouri there have been several curious changes in the fauna. Thus, magpies have greatly decreased in number, owing, I believe, mainly to the wolf hunters. Magpies often come around carcasses and eat poisoned baits. I have seen as many as 7 lying dead around a bait. They are much less plentiful than they formerly were. In this last year, 1894, I saw 1 large party, otherwise only 2 or 3 stragglers. This same year I was rather surprised at meeting a porcupine, usually a beast of the timber, at least 20 miles from trees. He was grubbing after sagebrush roots on the edge of a cut bank by a half-dried creek. I was stalking an antelope at the time, and stopped to watch him for about 5 minutes. He paid no heed to me, though I was within 3 or 4 paces of him. Both the lucifer or northern lynx and the wolverine had been found on the Little Missouri, near the Killdeer Mountains, but I do not know of a specimen of either that has been killed there for some years past. The black-footed ferret was always rare, and is rare now. But few beaver are left. They were very abundant in 1880, but were speedily trapped out when the Indians vanished and the Northern Pacific Railroad was built. While this railroad was building, the bears frequently caused much trouble by industriously damming the culverts. With us the first animal to disappear was the buffalo. In the old days, say from 1870 to 1880, the buffalo were probably the most abundant of all animals along the Little Missouri, in the region that I know, ranging, say, from Pretty Buttes to the Killdeer Mountains. They were migratory, and at times almost all of them might leave. But on the whole, they were the most abundant of the game animals. In 1881, they were still almost as numerous as ever. In 1883, all were killed but a few stragglers, and the last of these stragglers that I heard of as seen in our immediate neighborhood was in 1885. The second game animal in point of abundance was the blacktail. It did not go out on the prairies, but in the broken country adjoining the river it was far more plentiful than any other kind of game. It is greatly reduced in numbers now. Blacktail were not much slaughtered until the buffalo began to give out, say in 1882, but they are probably now not a 20th as plentiful as they were in that year. Elk were plentiful in 1880, though never anything like as abundant as the buffalo and the blacktail. Only straggling parties or individuals have been seen since 1883. The last I shot near my ranch was in 1886, but 2 or 3 have been shot since, and a cow and calf were seen, chased and almost roped by the riders on the roundup in the fall of 1893. Doubtless 1 or 2 still linger even yet in inaccessible places. Whitetail were never as numerous as the other game, but they have held their own well. Though they have decreased in numbers, the decrease is by no means as great as of the blacktail, and a good many can be shot yet. A dozen years ago probably 20 blacktail were killed for every one whitetail. Now the numbers are about equal. Antelope were plentiful in the old days, though not nearly so much so as buffalo and blacktail. The hunters did not molest them while the buffalo and elk lasted, and they then turned their attention to the blacktails. For some years after 1880, I think the pronghorn in our neighborhood positively increased in numbers. In 1886 I thought them more plentiful than I had ever known them before. Since then they have decreased, and in the last 2 years the decrease has been quite rapid. Mountain sheep were never very plentiful, and during the last dozen years they have decreased proportionately less than any other game. Bears have decreased in numbers, and have become very shy and difficult to get at. They were never plentiful. Cougars were always very scarce. There were 2 stages of hunting in our country, as in almost all other countries similarly situated. In 1880 the Northern Pacific Railroad was built nearly to the edge of the Bad Lands, and the danger of Indian war was totally eliminated. A great inrush of hunters followed. In 1881, 1882, and 1883, buffalo, elk, and blacktail were slaughtered in enormous numbers, and a good many whitetail and prongbuck were killed too. By 1884 the game had been so thinned out that hide hunting and meat hunting had ceased to pay. A few professional hunters remained, but most of them moved elsewhere, or were obliged to go into other business. From that time the hunting has chiefly been done by the ranchers and occasional small grangers. In consequence, for 6 or 8 years the game about held its own, the antelope, as I have said above, at one time increasing. But the gradual increase in the number of actual settlers is now beginning to tell, and the game is becoming slowly scarcer. The only wild animals that have increased with us are the wolves. These are more plentiful now than they were 10 years ago. I have never known them so numerous or so daring in their assaults on stock as in 1894. They not only kill colts and calves, but full-grown steers and horses. Quite a number have been poisoned, but they are very wary about taking baits. Quite a number have also been roped by the men on the roundup who have happened to run across them when gorged from feeding at a carcass. Nevertheless, for the last few years they have tended to increase in numbers, though they are so wary and nowadays so strictly nocturnal in their habits that they are not often seen. This great increase, following a great diminution in the numbers of wolves along the Little Missouri, is very curious. 20 years ago, or thereabouts, wolves were common, and they were then frequently seen by every traveler and hunter. With the advent of the wolfers, who poisoned them for their skins, they disappeared, the disappearance being only partly explicable, however, by the poisoning. For a number of years they continued scarce, but during the last 4 or 5 they have again grown numerous. Why, I cannot say. I wish that there were sufficient data at hand to tell whether they have decreased during these 4 or 5 years in neighboring regions, say in central and eastern Montana. Another curious feature of the case is that the white wolves, which in the middle of the century were so common in this region, are now very rare. I have heard of but one, which was seen on the Upper Cannonball in 1892. One nearly black wolf was killed in 1893. I suppose all hunters are continually asked what rifles they use. Any good modern rifle is good enough, and after a certain degree of excellence in the weapon is attained, the difference between it and a somewhat better rifle counts for comparatively little compared to the difference in the skill, nerve, and judgment of the men using them. Moreover, there is room for a great deal of individual variation of opinion among experts as to rifles. I personally prefer the Winchester. I used a 45-75 until I broke it in a fall while goat hunting, and since then I have used a 45-90. For my own use I consider either gun much preferable to the 500 and 577 caliber double-barrel Express for use with bears, buffalo, moose, and elk. Yet my brother, for instance, always preferred the double-barreled Express. Mr. Theodore Van Dyke prefers the large bore, and Mr. H. L. Stimson has had built a special 577 Winchester, which he tells me he finds excellent for grizzly bears. There is the same difference of opinion among men who hunt game on other continents than ours. Thus, Mr. Royal Carroll, in shooting rhinoceros, buffalo, and the like in South Africa, preferred big, heavy English double barrels, while Mr. William Chandler, after trying these same double barrels, finally threw them aside in favor of the 4590 Winchester, for use even against such large and thick-hided beasts as rhinoceros. In a letter to the London Field, he happened to mention that he preferred for rhinoceros and other large game the 4590 Winchester to the double-barrel 577, so frequently produced by the English gun-makers. His letter was followed by a perfect chorus of protests in the shape of other letters by men who preferred the double-barrel. These men had a perfect right to their opinions, but the comic feature of their letters was that, as a rule, they almost seemed to think that Mr. Chandler's preference of the 4590 repeater showed some kind of moral delinquency on his part, while the gun-maker, whose double-barrel Mr. Chandler had discarded in favor of the Winchester, solemnly produced tests to show that the bullets from his gun had more penetration than those from the Winchester, which had no more to do with the question than the production by the Winchester people of targets to show that this weapon possessed superior accuracy would have had. Of course, the element of penetration is only one of 20 entering into the question. Accuracy, handiness, rapidity of fire, penetration, shock, all have to be considered. Penetration is useless after a certain point has been reached. Shock is useless if it is gained at too great expense of penetration or accuracy. Flatness of trajectory, though admirable, is not as important as accuracy, and when gained at a great expense of accuracy is simply a disadvantage. All of these points are admirably discussed in Mr. A. C. Gould's Modern American Rifles. In the right place, a fair-sized bullet is as good as a very big one. In the wrong place, the big one is best. But the medium one will do more good in the right place than the big one away from its right place, and if it is more accurate, it is therefore preferable. Entirely apart from the merit of guns, there is a considerable element of mere fashion in them. For the last 20 years there has been much controversy between the advocates of two styles of rifles. That is, the weapon with a comparatively small bore and long, solid bullet, and a moderate charge of powder, and the weapon of comparatively large bore, with a very heavy charge of powder and a short bullet, often with a hollow end. The first is the type of rifle that has always been used by 99 out of 100 American hunters, and indeed it is the only kind of rifle that has ever been used to any extent in North America. The second is the favorite weapon of English sportsmen in those grandest of the world's hunting grounds, India and South Africa. When a single-shot rifle is not used, the American usually takes a repeater, the Englishman a double-barrel. Each type has some good qualities that the other lacks, and each has some defects. The personal equation must always be taken into account in dealing with either. Excellent sportsmen of equal experience give conflicting accounts of the performances of the two types. Personally, I think that the American type is nearer right. In reading the last book of the great South African hunter, Mr. Selous, I noticed with much interest that in hunting elephants he and many of the Dutch elephant hunters had abandoned the huge 4 and 8 bores championed by that doughty hunter, Sir Samuel Baker, and had adopted precisely the type of rifle which was in almost universal use among the American buffalo hunters from 1870 to 1883. That is, a rifle of .45 caliber, shooting 75 grains of powder and a bullet of 550 grains. The favorite weapon of the American buffalo hunter was a Sharps rifle of .45 caliber, shooting about 550 grains of lead, and using ordinarily 90 to 110 grains of powder, which, however, was probably not as strong as the powder used by Mr. Selous. In other words, the types of gun were identically the same. I have elsewhere stated that by actual experience the big double-barreled English 8 and 10 bores were found inferior to Sharp's rifle for bison hunting and on the western plains. I know nothing about elephant or rhinoceros shooting, but my own experience with bison, bear, moose, and elk has long convinced me that for them and for all similar animals, including, I have no doubt, the lion and the tiger, the 45-90 type of repeater is, on the whole, the best of the existing sporting rifles for my own use. I have of late years loaded my cartridges not with the ordinary rifle powder, but with 85 grains of orange lightning, and have used a bullet with 350 grains of lead, and then have bored a small hole, taking out 15 or 20 grains in the point. But for heavy game I think the solid bullet better. Judging from what I have been told by some of my friends, however, it seems not unlikely that the best sporting rifle will ultimately prove to be the very small caliber repeating rifle now found in various forms in the military service of all countries, a caliber of say .256 or .310, with 40 grains of powder and a 200 grain bullet. These rifles possess marvelous accuracy and a very flat trajectory. The speed of the bullet causes it to mushroom if made of lead, and gives it great penetration if hardened. Certain of my friends have used rifles of this type on bears, caribou, and deer. They were said to be far superior to the ordinary sporting rifle. A repeating rifle of this type is really merely a much more perfect form of the repeating rifles that have for so long been favorites with American hunters. But these are merely my personal opinions, and as I said before, among the many kinds of excellent sporting rifles turned out by the best modern makers, each has its special good points and its special defects, and equally good sportsmen, of equally wide experience, will be found to vary widely in their judgment of the relative worth of the different weapons. Some people can do better with one rifle, and some with another, and in the long run, it is the man behind the gun that counts most. End of Chapter 11, Part 2 of Hunting in the Cattle Country.